The Halifax disaster explosion. G'day guys, how's it going? My name is AussieTash. This video has been suggested to me by so many of my subscribers. Got a feeling I'm in for an emotional ride again, but looking forward to the video. Before we do, please make sure to jump on, hit that subscribe button. That would really help me out. Okay, let's get into it. The Halifax disaster. Let's go.
December 6, 1917. The Great War is raging in much of the Eurasian continent, nearly entering its fourth year. The magnitude of death and destruction is beyond anything humanity has ever witnessed before. The advent of high explosives in the late 19th century has completely revolutionized the destructiveness of warfare. But on the other side of the world, in the quiet little Canadian port of Halifax, the largest man-made bomb ever devised this far was slowly sailing into port. It was about to become one of the greatest disasters in Canadian history. By 1917, the war in Europe had reached a fevered pitch. Intense trench warfare marred the conflict. New technology was developed constantly to better kill the enemy. Aircraft became a major player, and high explosives were used in massive abundance. Ships constantly streamed across the Atlantic, fueling the Allied war machine. But this was when the mighty German U-boat began to take effect, assailing Allied supply lines and making the already difficult trip a living nightmare. Halifax, Nova Scotia became a vital port to the Allies. The deepwater port remained largely ice-free throughout the year. The location of a few islands near the mouth made it extremely defensible, especially with the installation of submarine nets early on in the war. It became a perfect stopping-off point for convoys traveling from North America to Europe. The once quiet, rustic town of Halifax became a booming port town. Its harbor well suited for a staging point for convoys. The protected harbor of Bedford Basin lay beyond a tight mouth called the Narrows, just 1,000 feet wide, or 304 meters. They were protected from the elements, and the basin itself was deep and wide, good for anchoring ships waiting to be fueled and queuing up for a convoy. 20 to 30 ships would group up at a time before being escorted across the Atlantic by ships of the Royal Navy. Despite Halifax being a relatively small and quiet town of about 60,000 people, its useful position would see its population soar. In just 1 month, as many as 15,000 troops had shipped out of Halifax. Several rail lines kept a steady stream of supplies and coal streaming into Bedford Basin to be shipped overseas to aid the war effort. But our tragedy doesn't begin in Halifax, but instead New York. On the 9th of November, the SS Mont Blanc, a 320-foot or 97-meter tramp steamer, sailed into New York after completing a long and treacherous trip from Bordeaux, France.
Okay.
The ship was nothing impressive. Built in 1899 by Sir Railton Dixon and Company of Middleborough in northern Yorkshire, she had already lived a long and neglectful life. Used to haul ore for several different companies, the ship was run constantly and maintained very little. Her triple expansion engine could scarcely push her along at a meager 7 knots. Now, pardon my pronunciation here, but when it was bought by the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, or the French line, in 1915, it wasn't much to look at. Too small and too slow for most jobs, the company simply put its money in thinking the French government would be hiring just about anything that could float and carry goods at the time. They bet correctly, as the Mont Blanc was quickly contracted to haul supplies across the Atlantic. The Mont Blanc was 3,279 gross registered tons, and 320 feet or 97 meters in length. She was 44 feet or 13 meters at the beam, and had roughly a 15-foot or 4-meter draft. It was powered by one triple expansion steam engine and propelled by a single screw. During her service in the Great War, she was outfitted with 2 guns fore and aft for general defense during transatlantic crossings. On this November day, her new captain brought her into port. Once more, pardon my French, my pronunciation isn't that great. For Captain Aimé Joseph Marie Lamedec, this had been his first crossing aboard Mont Blanc. The 38-year-old captain had been at sea for 22 of those years. He had achieved his captain's papers just 2 years prior, but he was seen as a skilled and very by-the-book mariner. But quickly the crew realized this would not be a by-the-book trip.
Okay, so I'm guessing there is a story as to why we've just heard the history of the Mont Blanc, and we're hearing the story about this captain. Might have to do with the explosion, not quite too sure. Let's just get into it and find out.
They were ordered by the French Admiralty to bypass their usual New York dock and proceed on to Gravesend Bay in Brooklyn. While in Gravesend Bay, the Mont Blanc was descended upon by a small army of shipwrights who proceeded to practically rebuild the ship's cargo hold. Every bulkhead and deck space was covered in wood, cloth, tar, and rubber. Small partition compartments were made of wood and even fastened together with copper nails. All of this occurred before a small rotation of police started to guard the ship, ensuring no one was on or off without them knowing. These things only helped confirm the growing fears of the crew, which were soon realized as stevedores began to load the volatile cargo onto the Mont Blanc.
Oh, okay.
So what was in that cargo? 62 tons of gun cotton, a compound used in place of gunpowder in firing artillery. 250 tons of TNT, a well-known high explosive, and 2,366 tons of picric acid. And at this time, lesser known but even more volatile high explosive.
Wow.
The flashing point of TNT being around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The flash point for picric acid is only around 572 degrees. Thus, the point of all the partitions and sparkless fittings was to keep any sparks out of the volatile cargo. The crew were even forbidden from carrying matches while on board. So once the Mont Blanc was fully loaded, she came out to around 3 kilotons of TNT, about a fifth of the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima several decades later. A volatile cargo, to say the least. But when packed safely in the hold with its wooden compartments and sparkless fittings, a relatively safe cargo. Nothing short of a massive jolt or an out-of-control fire could detonate it.
Is that really a relatively safe cargo? I don't think so. So, this old boat, this Mont Blanc, was sailed to New York, got the once over, they done it up a little bit to make sure it's safe. They filled it up with all these TNT and other explosive stuff, and safe cargo, apparently. I guess we'll see what happens.
Confusingly, the stevedores received a last-minute order from the French government. There was still room aboard Mont Blanc, so they ordered the onloading of 494 barrels of benzol. Benzol was a newly created coal tar product made of benzene and toluene. It had many uses, but during World War I, it was used mostly for motor fuel. One thing was well known about it: it was highly flammable. The barrels were stacked wherever there was room, inside the cargo hold and even on deck where they could be 3 or 4 barrels high. While the TNT and picric acid was fastened down tight, the barrels were more slapdash, with thin canvas straps over stacks of barrels. It was a more rushed job for what seemed like a less hazardous cargo. But with flammable benzol over high explosives, in essence they had simply added the fuse to the world's biggest bomb up to that point.
Yeah.
High explosives had a very high ignition temperature, but surrounded by fuel, they now had the means to achieve just that. On December 1st, the Mont Blanc was fully loaded and ready to depart for Europe. Captain Le Medec would meet with the British Admiralty. They were responsible for organizing the convoys that crossed the Atlantic. The liaison asked if the Mont Blanc could maintain a speed of just 8 knots. Le Medec, who was still new to the ship, consulted his logs and was remiss to say she probably could not.
Why?
The officer was, of course, concerned. A convoy could only go the speed of its slowest ship. The Mont Blanc would be slowing down an entire convoy. So he ordered the ship to sail unescorted to Halifax, Nova Scotia. There her fate would be left in the hands of the convoy officer. If he determined she could not keep up, Captain Le Medec was given a secret alternate route in an envelope to open and follow should the need arise. So the Mont Blanc would depart, its entire crew on edge. They slowly sailed north, hugging the American and Canadian shore, trying desperately to fight through a storm that blew in from the west. Each wave they plowed through felt like it would detonate the powder keg they now stood upon. Sleep was light and fitful for all aboard during that few days' journey.
Okay, so let me get this right. Because the Mont Blanc was so full of all this safe cargo, so they say, it couldn't keep up with the speed that they wanted to get it to sail to Europe in the convoy. So instead, they sent it to Halifax, all filled up with the TNT and all those gases and fuels and everything else, not knowing if they were going to make it there because the sea was so rough and anything could just boom, set on fire. The captain's on edge, the crew's on edge, yet they still say, sail there anyway. Bit crazy, isn't it? Bit crazy.
Meanwhile, plying its way across the North Atlantic bound for the same port of Halifax was the SS Imo. This Norwegian-registered whaling factory ship had ceased its whaling duties for a far more humanitarian duty. It was chartered by the Belgian Relief Commission to carry vital supplies and humanitarian aid across the Atlantic to the beleaguered region of Europe. Being a neutral nation and a humanitarian duty, it was believed that it would be unmolested by German U-boats. But just to ensure this, a large Belgian relief in large 10-foot-tall letters was painted across the sides, just in case. Built in 1889 in Belfast, Ireland, the 5,043-ton freighter was already fairly past its prime. 430 feet or 131 meters in length, with a 45-foot or 13-meter beam and a 30-foot or 9-meter draft. With her single triple expansion engine, she could produce about 424 nominal horsepower, pushing her along at 12 knots, nearly double the Mont Blanc. At the time, she was heading from Rotterdam for Halifax, ballasted down, her final destination being New York for supplies to bring back to Europe. At the command of Imo was 47-year-old Norwegian captain Håkon From. With nearly 30 years of experience on the sea, From was an accomplished and skilled mariner. He was steely-eyed and focused, but he was well known for his impatience and even bouts of rage. On a previous trip to Philadelphia, the Imo docked to receive repairs to the ship's engine and boiler. The repairs were performed by Schmal Engineering Works. They took 10 days and the company owner quoted it at about $9,000. Well over $200,000 USD in today's currency.
Oh, yeah.
But when Gustav Schmal came to collect his payment for a job well done, Captain Fraum refused to pay and refused to elaborate upon why. Schmal, frustrated at this, departed and returned with his attorney. But this still didn't cause the tight-fisted Fraum to budge. When the attorney departed to repair legal papers, Fraum fell into a fit of rage. Schmal recounts, he acted like a maniac. Fraum glared at me like a man out of his mind and snarled like a beast. Raising his big fists, he brought them down on my head, knocking me to the floor. Then, cursing horribly, he picked me up bodily and hurled me through the door of the cabin. As soon as I regained my feet, I ran for my life. After that, Fraum unmoored his repaired yet unpaid-for Imo and fled. He sailed down the Delaware until Schmal's attorney and the U.S. Marshals caught up with the Imo with a tugboat. Now Fraum wasn't just fixed with the $9,000 for the repair, but an additional $11,000 for his assault and flight.
That's not good.
No explanation was ever offered for his actions except from his own attorney that stated Fraum was deeply anti-German. Gustav Schmal, of course, being of German ancestry. Norway, despite being neutral in the present conflict, had suffered greatly to German torpedoes and mines, leaving a deep resentment for the country in the hearts of many Norwegian mariners. So despite being a competent and capable mariner, Captain Fraum was short-tempered and impatient. So you can imagine the captain's great displeasure upon arriving in Halifax and hearing he'd have to wait for an inspection, as well as having to wait to receive bunkering. The vital convoy ships in the harbor taking precedence over his neutral relief ship. The Mont Blanc finished her 850-mile journey northwest through storm and gale, arriving outside Halifax Harbor on the 5th of December. They steamed for an examination anchorage outside McNabb's Island as a Royal Canadian Navy tugboat steamed out to meet them. They were arriving just at sunset, darkness falling as a harbor tug deposited one of Halifax's harbor pilots aboard. Hopping aboard was 45-year-old Haligonian Francis Mackey. The pilot had been to sea since he was a mere 12 years old, and became an apprentice pilot at just 21, gaining his master's papers in 1899. By 1917, Mackey had been guiding ships into the port of Halifax for 24 years.
Okay, so I'm guessing we're learning the history of these two boats because they're the two boats that collide into each other. And we're just getting an overview of the history of the captains, how experienced they were, what they were feeling at the time, how they were feeling at the time. The captain of the second boat, he was angry. He was fleeing because he didn't want to pay his bill. And he got slapped with another bill for running away. I'm liking learning about the background story of the two boats and the two captains. Guess it's just leading up to the story, so let's hear some more.
Captain Lemedec and Francis Mackey greeted one another, Lemedec's English only barely passable. The pair retired to the captain's cabin, where Mackey learned, with some dismay, just what the Mont Blanc was hauling. It made little difference to his job as a pilot, but of course he was set on edge knowing he'd be piloting a massive bomb into Halifax.
Yeah.
Mackey then tried to explain with great difficulty that the ship would likely have to stay out of the harbor until morning. The submarine nets strung across the mouth of the harbor would be lifted into place for the night. He finally got his point across as the Canadian Navy ship inspector climbed aboard to speak with the captain and check his manifest before departing for the night. That Wednesday night, Mont Blanc would sit anchored near the McNabb's Island lighthouse, waiting for dawn. Aboard, Captain Lamadec, pilot Francis McKay, and the officers of the Mont Blanc sat and ate dinner and had some coffee as they made an attempt at conversation. McKay produced some cigars, offering them to the others, who looked at him with concern before the captain firmly stated,
No.
Non, il est interdit de fumer. No smoking on the ship.
No.
The following morning, Thursday, the 6th of December, the anti-submarine nets were lowered as Mont Blanc received the signal to proceed north towards Halifax to her temporary berthing in Bedford Basin. At 7:50, she lifted anchor. It was just a 90-minute trip. Then she would anchor for the day, then proceed east across the Atlantic with a convoy, this time the following morning.
Okay, so that dude knew that there was TNT and other explosive devices on the Mont Blanc, yet pulled out some cigars and said, hey, you want to smoke? Don't think he's that bright upstairs, do you? My gosh.
Typically, with her hazardous cargo, the Mont Blanc would display the Bravo flag, a red flag with a swallowtail to denote that she had hazardous cargo on board. But due to it being wartime, this protocol was often waived, the flag only being good for showing the enemy exactly which ship in a convoy will make the biggest boom. As Mont Blanc started her morning trip northbound to Bedford Basin, the Imo was on a reciprocal course. She had finished her bunkering the night before, but was too late to get underway for New York, much to the chagrin of Captain Fromm. But in the morning of the 6th, the Imo pulled the hook. It was now underway and steaming south out of Bedford Basin and into the Narrows. Acting as the pilot on this outbound trip was harbor pilot William Hayes. The 43-year-old was born near to Halifax just as his comrade Francis McKay was. In fact, both were very close friends. Both were extremely skilled mariners, Hayes having over 2 decades of experience under his belt. Both ships appearing to be in very good hands as they began their morning transits. The Imo heading south to open ocean and then New York, the Mont Blanc north into Bedford Basin. But the Imo's trip south through the Narrows would not go uninterrupted. We know this because I'm doing a video about the disaster that ensued from it. At around 8:15, the Imo entered the narrow channel to their starboard side of the channel, Halifax to their right and Dartmouth to their left, on the far side of the Narrows. They were traveling at a good clip, around 7 knots, fairly fast for inside the harbor. But upon entering the channel, they were met with a tramp steamer, the SS Clara, steaming upwards towards them, also on the starboard side of the channel. Typically, this was seen as poor seamanship, the rules dictating that you should favor the side of the channel that lay to your starboard. Hayes, a bit irritated with the Clara's departure to the rules, signaled on the ship's whistle 1 short blast. This indicated that he wished to pass to the port of Clara, a subtle hint for the steamer to move towards the correct side of the channel. Adamantly, Clara answered with 2 short blasts, indicating she wished to pass the Imo to her starboard and keeping to the wrong side of the channel. Hayes was irritated, but in a hurry. He answered the signal with 2 short as well and adjusted his course to port, putting the Imo more towards the center of the narrow channel and nearer to the wrong side of the channel.
Okay, so you've got impatient, angry captains that don't want to listen to each other and have no idea that they're setting their boats into a collision course with each other. My gosh. Okay, we're going to wrap this one up. That was part 1 of the Halifax disaster. Stay tuned for part 2. I've got a feeling it's going to be really, really emotional, really, really sad. If you enjoyed that video, please smash the like button, leave a comment, and remember to subscribe. That would really help me out. Stay tuned for part 2. Cheers from down under. Take care. Bye.